If you're watching this, maybe you felt something isn't right about what you were taught. The stories don't add up. The history doesn't match. I've been there, and Spinoza gave me the answers. Stay with me to the end.
You were told Moses wrote the Bible. He didn't. Spinoza proved it 300 years ago and was destroyed for it. 6 men wrote the entire Old Testament. We know when. We know why. And one of them buried the evidence inside a temple wall. Right. Let me be precise about this, because precision matters when you're dismantling something this old. The first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, are called the Torah in Hebrew, the Pentateuch in Greek. For over 2,000 years, the unquestioned assumption of the Jewish and Christian traditions has been that Moses wrote them, all of them. Every word, either directly dictated by God or composed under divine inspiration. It is one of the most foundational claims in Western religion, and it is almost certainly wrong. But before I show you the evidence, you need to understand what Spinoza noticed that no one before him had dared to say publicly. Baruch Spinoza, the Dutch Jewish philosopher who was excommunicated from his community at the age of 23, did something that no one had done before with such rigor. He read the Torah not as a sacred text, but as a text. He applied the same methods you would apply to any ancient document, and what he found was devastating. Moses is referred to throughout the Torah in the third person, not I did this or I said that, but Moses did this, Moses said that. The narrator is clearly someone other than Moses, writing about Moses from the outside, at a distance. And it gets worse. The Torah describes in detail the death and burial of Moses. Deuteronomy chapter 34. And Moses died there in the land of Moab, and no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day. Moses did not write his own death scene. That much is obvious. But the phrase unto this day is even more telling. It implies the writer is looking back from a much later period, centuries after the event. There is something hidden in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. 2 completely different stories, written by 2 different people, and when you see it, you cannot unsee it. And there are place names in the Torah that did not exist in Moses' time. The text refers to locations by names they acquired centuries later, names that would have meant nothing to Moses or his contemporaries. Spinoza noticed all of this. He noticed that one passage even compares Moses to all the prophets who came after him, which means the author was writing after the age of the prophets, hundreds of years after Moses would have lived. Spinoza laid this out methodically, carefully, point by point. And he noticed something else, something even more troubling than the anachronisms in the third-person narration. He noticed that the Torah contains passages that directly contradict each other, not minor discrepancies. Fundamental contradictions in the nature of God, the order of creation, the details of central events. The kind of contradictions that only make sense if different people with different theologies wrote different parts. And for his trouble, he was expelled from his community. His works were banned. He spent the rest of his life grinding lenses to survive. The cherem, the excommunication, was one of the harshest ever issued by the Amsterdam Jewish community. They cursed him. They forbade anyone from speaking to him, reading his work, or standing within 4 cubits of his presence. He was 23 years old. The institutions that controlled religion could not allow his questions to stand. But the questions did not disappear. They only grew sharper. And here is what makes this extraordinary. The 2 authors did not just disagree on details. They disagreed on the fundamental nature of God. Now, I need to show you something. And once I show you, you will see it every time you open the book of Genesis. There are 2 creation stories, not 1. 2. They sit side by side in Genesis, and they contradict each other on almost every point. In Genesis chapter 1, God is called Elohim. He creates the world in 6 days, in a precise liturgical order. Light, then sky, then land, then plants, then animals, then humans. Male and female are created together, simultaneously, at the very end. It is orderly. It is cosmic. It reads almost like a hymn. In Genesis chapter 2, God is called YHWH, the personal name, the tetragrammaton. And the story is completely different. YHWH forms man from the dust of the ground and breathes life into his nostrils. He plants a garden. He creates animals to keep the man company. And only when none of them are suitable does he create woman from the man's rib. The tone is intimate, earthy, almost physical. It is a completely different story, told by a completely different voice. Three scholars working across 3 centuries all reached the same conclusion independently. And the evidence they found was hiding in plain sight. And it is not just the creation. The flood narrative in Genesis is doubled. In one version, Noah takes 2 of every animal. In the other, he takes 7 of clean animals and 2 of unclean, 2 of every kind, or 7. You cannot have both, unless there were 2 different writers with 2 different versions, and someone wove them together. I remember the night I saw this for the first time. I had been working with 2 printed pages of Genesis, one highlighting every passage that used Elohim, the other highlighting every passage that used HWH. I laid them side by side on my desk, under the brass lamp. The tea had gone cold hours ago, and when I separated them, when I pulled apart the strands, each one read as a complete, coherent narrative on its own. 2 stories, interlocked like fingers. Written by 2 different people, in 2 different centuries, with 2 completely different understandings of God. I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantelpiece. And I thought, everything I was taught about this book is wrong. Not because someone lied to me, but because no one ever showed me this. But the most remarkable part of this story is not about who wrote the Bible. It is about who planted it. The observation that the Torah uses 2 different names for God was first made formally by a French physician named Jean Astruc in 1753. Astruc was the personal doctor to King Louis XV of France. He was not a theologian. He was not attacking the church. He was simply reading Genesis carefully, and he noticed what I just showed you, 2 parallel accounts, distinguished by the names they used for God. But it was the German scholar Julius Wellhausen, over a century later, who built the full framework. In 1878, Wellhausen published his reconstruction of the Torah's composition. He identified 4 distinct sources, 4 different authors, writing in 4 different centuries for 4 different audiences. The first was J, the Jahwist, named for his use of YHWH, written around 950 BC in the southern kingdom of Judah. The second was E, the Elohist, named for his use of Elohim, written around 850 BC in the northern kingdom of Israel. The third was D, the Deuteronomist, written around 622 BC during the reign of King Josiah. And the fourth was P, the priestly source, written around 550 BC during the Babylonian exile. Richard Elliott Friedman, in his landmark book Who Wrote the Bible, modernized this framework. He traced the individual strands with extraordinary precision. He showed how you could physically separate the Torah into its component parts. And each part told a coherent story on its own, with its own vocabulary, its own theology, its own concerns. Friedman went further than Wellhausen. He attempted to identify who these authors actually were. Not just abstract labels, JEDP, but real people, embedded in real political situations. The J author, he suggested, may have been connected to the court in Judah during the early monarchy. The E author likely came from priestly circles in the north, possibly from Shiloh. The D author was almost certainly connected to the circle we are about to discuss, a scribal family, whose fingerprints are all over the most audacious deception in biblical history. What I'm about to tell you next will change how you read every single word of the Old Testament. Once you see the seams, you can never unsee them. I need you to understand that before we continue. This is not speculation. This is textual analysis. The same kind of analysis you would apply to any ancient document composed from multiple sources. And the evidence has been sitting in the text for thousands of years, waiting for someone to look at it, without the assumption that it was written by one man. A king, a priest, and a scribe walked into a temple in 622 BC, and what happened next shaped the course of Western civilization. In 622 BC, King Josiah of Judah ordered renovations to the temple in Jerusalem. The temple was in disrepair. Josiah was a reformer, or at least that is how the biblical text presents him. During the renovations, The high priest Hilkiah announced that he had found a scroll in the temple, a lost book of the law supposedly written by Moses himself, long forgotten in the walls of the sacred building. The scroll was brought to the royal scribe, a man named Shaphan. Shaphan read it. Shaphan brought it to King Josiah. And when Josiah heard the words of this scroll, he tore his robes in distress, or so the account tells us, and immediately launched the most sweeping religious reform in the history of ancient Israel. The scroll was not old. It was brand new, and the priest who found it almost certainly helped write it. The scroll was Deuteronomy, or more precisely, the core of what became the book of Deuteronomy. And many scholars, and I mean many, this is not a fringe position, believe that Shaphan and his circle of scribes actually composed this document. They wrote it, then they planted it in the temple, then they staged its discovery. The purpose was political. Deuteronomy's central demand is that all worship must be centralized in Jerusalem. No more local shrines, no more village altars, no more regional priests with their own traditions and their own authority. Everything must flow through the temple in Jerusalem, which meant everything must flow through the priests and the king who controlled it. I spent a summer reading Deuteronomy in Hebrew years ago, with an interlinear text and a dictionary that weighed more than my arm. And something struck me that I had never noticed reading it in English. The vocabulary is different. The style is different. It does not read like Genesis or Exodus or Numbers. It reads like a political speech. Every second paragraph contains a centralizing command. Worship here, sacrifice here, bring your tithes here. I started underlining every political phrase, every consolidating instruction. I filled 3 pages of notes in a single sitting. Outside, the birds were singing. I remember that. The absurd contrast of birdsong and a 3,000-year-old power grab. The pencil lead was smudging on the margins, and I thought, this is not revelation. This is legislation dressed as revelation. And then in 587 BC, everything they had built was destroyed. But from that destruction, they constructed something even more powerful. If you grew up believing Moses received the Torah from God on Mount Sinai, what comes next challenges that at its foundation. The evidence is clear, and it does not care about tradition. In 587 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, besieged Jerusalem. He broke through the walls. He burned the temple, Solomon's temple, the center of Israelite worship, the house of YHWH, to the ground. And he deported the priestly class, the scribes, the educated elite, to Babylon. It was a catastrophe without parallel in Israelite history. Everything they had, the temple, the monarchy, the land, was gone. And in that void, in that exile, the surviving priests did something extraordinary. They wrote. They wrote the priestly source, the P strand. Genesis chapter 1, that majestic, orderly creation account that is P Leviticus, with its detailed ritual laws, P the genealogies, the precise measurements, the elaborate instructions for worship, all P. Every passage designed to preserve communal identity in the absence of a temple, in the absence of a homeland. If you cannot sacrifice in Jerusalem, you can at least follow the dietary laws. If you cannot worship at the temple, you can at least observe the Sabbath. P was survival literature. It was identity preservation written in the language of religion. 150 years of digging, the most excavated region on earth. And what they found was nothing. And here is the theological shift that almost no one in the pews has been told about. Before the exile, the Israelites were not monotheists. They were monolatrists. They worshipped YHWH as their god, but they acknowledged that other gods existed. The other nations had their gods. YHWH was simply the God of Israel. It is only during and after the exile, when the priests needed to explain why their God had allowed their total destruction, that strict monotheism emerges. YHWH is not merely the best God, he is the only God. The destruction of Jerusalem was not proof of YHWH's weakness, it was proof of his power, wielding Babylon as punishment for Israel's sins. Monotheism was not revealed to Moses on a mountain. It was invented by exiled priests in Mesopotamia, roughly 1,000 years after the time Moses was supposed to have lived. The God who supposedly created the heavens and the earth in Genesis chapter 1, that grand cosmic all-powerful deity, was himself created by human beings at a specific moment in history. for a specific purpose. But here is what the archaeology reveals about the stories these priests inherited, and this is something most believers have never been told. Israel Finkelstein, professor of archaeology at Tel Aviv University, one of the most respected archaeologists working in the region, published The Bible Unearthed with devastating conclusions. After a century and a half of systematic excavation across Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Levant, there is no archaeological evidence for the Exodus as described in the Bible. None. No trace of 2 million people wandering the desert for 40 years. No campsites, no pottery, no remains. The conquest of Canaan? Jericho, the city whose walls supposedly came tumbling down, had no walls at the time of the supposed conquest. The city was abandoned. Ai, another city Joshua is said to have destroyed, was uninhabited for 1,000 years before the supposed attack. The united monarchy of David and Solomon? Finkelstein found that Jerusalem in the 10th century BC was a small hilltop settlement, not the grand capital of a vast empire. The patriarchal narratives contain anachronisms, references to domesticated camels, for instance, centuries before camels were domesticated in the region, references to Philistines before the Philistines arrived. The Bible, as Finkelstein argues, is primarily a 7th century document, not ancient history transmitted faithfully from the time of Moses, but a theological and political construction written during and after the reign of Josiah, designed to serve the interests of the people who wrote it. Now, I want to be precise. Finkelstein is not saying the Bible is fiction. He is saying it is not history in the modern sense. It is a theological document that uses the past, reimagines the past, constructs the past, to serve present political and religious needs. The Exodus story, whether or not it contains any kernel of historical memory, was shaped and told by people who needed their nation to have a founding myth. A story of liberation, a covenant with a God who chose them above all other nations. That story was not recorded. It was crafted, and the people who crafted it had reasons. I was told, in a quiet office with the door closed, that I should reconsider, that my career depended on it. I lost something for saying this publicly. Not everyone thinks you should hear it. But I believe you have the right to know who actually wrote the book you were told was dictated by God. 6 hands, 6 distinct voices. Across 5 centuries, you can hear them if you know what to listen for. And I am about to show you exactly how. So let me lay this out for you plainly. The Torah was not written by Moses. It was composed by at least 6 identifiable editorial hands, working across roughly 500 years. Just the Yahwist, writing in the southern kingdom of Judah around 950 BC. He gave us the intimate earthy stories, the Garden of Eden, Cain and Abel, the personal God who walks in the garden and wrestles with Jacob. The Elohist, writing in the northern kingdom of Israel around 850 BC. He gave us a more distant cosmic deity, the God who speaks through dreams and angels rather than face to face. After the northern kingdom fell to Assyria in 722 BC, someone, a redactor, wove J and E together into a single narrative. The J-E editor, that is the third hand. D, the Deuteronomist, writing in Josiah's court around 622 BC, the scribal circle of Shaphan, the people who planted a scroll in the temple wall and called it the Word of God. P, the priestly source, writing in Babylon around 550 BC, the exiled priests who turned catastrophe into theology and created monotheism in the process. And finally, a redactor, possibly Ezra, the priest scribe who returned from Babylon around 450 BC, who compiled everything into the Torah as we know it, the sixth hand. Each of these writers had political motivations, theological agendas, institutional interests. None of them was simply recording history. They were constructing it, shaping it, deciding what the past should look like in order to serve the needs of the present. I presented a version of this at my university years ago, a carefully framed, academically rigorous paper on non-Mosaic authorship. I thought it was uncontroversial. This is, after all, the mainstream position in biblical scholarship. 2 days later, my department head called me into his office. Small room, fluorescent light buzzing overhead, framed diplomas on the wall. He sat behind his desk with his hands flat on the surface, and he would not quite meet my eyes. He said, and I will never forget the precise politeness of his words, he suggested I might want to reconsider my research focus if I hoped to have my contract renewed. There was no shouting, no accusation, just a quiet institutional pressure as smooth and immovable as stone. I stood up. I thanked him. I walked out. And I went straight to the library. Because the evidence does not disappear just because someone finds it inconvenient. Spinoza saw this 300 years ago. He was the first to apply rigorous textual criticism to the Torah and conclude that Moses could not have been its author. And for that insight, he was expelled from his community, his works were banned, and he lived the rest of his life in effective exile. The institutions that controlled religious knowledge could not allow his questions to survive. But they did survive. And 3 centuries of scholarship have confirmed what he suspected, that the Torah is not the work of one man inspired by God, but the work of many men, inspired by politics, theology, survival, and power. The question is not whether Moses wrote the Bible. Scholars settled that a century ago. The question is why they still need you to believe he did. And that question, the question of why, is what should trouble you most. Because the institutions that taught you Moses wrote the Bible knew this evidence existed. The scholars in their universities discuss it openly. The textbooks in their seminaries present it as established fact. But somehow this information never reaches the people in the pews, the people who donate, the people who trust, the people who were never given the chance to decide for themselves. I want to be fair. There are scholars who defend traditional authorship, who argue that the documentary hypothesis has been overstated, that the evidence can be read differently, that later editing does not disprove an original Mosaic core. Kenneth Kitchen, for instance, has argued strenuously for a much earlier dating of the biblical texts, and that position deserves to be heard. I am not here to tell you what to believe. I am here to show you what you have not been shown. But here is the thing. Even if you reject the documentary hypothesis in its classical form, even if you believe J and E and P and D are too neat, too schematic, the evidence I have shown you today does not disappear. The 2 creation stories remain. The doubled flood narrative remains. The anachronisms remain. The archaeology remains. The silence of the desert remains. 150 years of digging and no trace of the Exodus. The Torah is a human document. That does not make it worthless. Quite the opposite. It makes it one of the most extraordinary achievements in the history of literature, a text composed by multiple hands across centuries, woven together so skillfully that for 2,000 years people believed it was the work of one man and his God. Right. That is where I will leave it. Take care of yourselves, and tell me in the comments, what made you think the most? Which part of this changed how you see the Bible? I read every single one. It helps me know what to research next. See you next time.
That's what Spinoza discovered. And now you know too. Stay curious, question everything. See you in the next one.